But the rule I was going to give was, we call it the vacation rule.
What's that?
One of our executives was on vacation with his family, and it was kind of rainy out. They were all they were supposed to go do X, Y, and Z. They couldn't do it. So they kind of went around the room of, what do you want to go do? And everyone was mopey. No one wanted to do anything. No one liked someone else's idea. So it just kind of turned into like a ho-hum experience. And then they decided, like, okay, this sucks. Sitting inside all day, all being kind of negative. We have a new rule, which is we're going to go do whatever the most enthusiastic person wants to do. So that like eliminates the debate. Whoever's most excited, we're going to go do your thing. So go get excited.
Is this thing on?
Yesterday's price is not today's price.
Welcome back to the Run the Numbers podcast. I'm your host, CJ, and today's conversation is with Matt Hudson, the CFO of Coda. Not only is Matt the chief financial officer, he was actually the first product manager at Coda. That's right. He's been a product manager at Google, YouTube, and he was the first PM at Coda. He talks about the misconceptions about product managers. We touch on, for CFOs and finance leaders, something they should understand about how to actually get the most out of product managers when you want to use them for your forecast, the different archetypes of product managers and which ones to go to for data inputs, and how to choose whether you should build something yourself or buy a tool. This is a hot topic lately. Should you use your resources to build something like a CRM or a MarTech tool internally versus go and buy one from companies that do that for a living? And he takes us through frameworks. This guy has frameworks for days. Eigenquestions. He tells us what an Eigenquestion is. He tells us about this masterful whiteboarding session they had. Hint, there's really only one question at the center of all questions. They've got some kick-ass investors on the cap table, including Reid, Hoffman, stories and frameworks from them. And he mentions that success is often attributed to luck rather than skill, something that I can't agree with more, but we dig into that and make it real. All this and much, much more after a short word from our sponsors. Well, if you've listened to this podcast before, you definitely know that I think it's cool to be a fan of business. I'm obsessed with researching how the best companies operate and specifically how they manage their money. And I've learned that a company's financial stack can make the difference between world domination and obscurity. That's why I want to tell you about Brex, because I want you to rule the world. Brex is an impressive financial services and software company that has grown immensely since it was founded in 2017. In just the last year alone, Brex accelerated customer acquisition by 50%, with 91% growth in enterprise customers. And there's good reason that over 30,000 companies from startups to enterprises have flocked to Brex. Brex offers the world's smartest corporate card on a full-stack global platform that is everything CFOs need to manage their finances on an elite level. Plus, they offer modern banking and treasury, as well as intuitive expenses and accounting automation, bill pay, and travel. Wow, it's all in the roster whenever you need it. Brex grows with you. CFOs tell me all the time that Brex makes it easy to control spend before it happens, automate annoying tasks, and optimize their finances. Because listen, at the end of the day, Brex helps them make every dollar count. So if you're a fan of smart businesses too, check out Brex at brex.com/metrics. That's brex.com/metrics. Ready to plan confidently, close faster, and report with accuracy? Here's what sets Planful apart. Imagine purpose-built solutions for every department, from FP&A to accounting, marketing to HR, all with built-in financial intelligence. It's easy to implement Planful in just weeks with minimal IT involvement, enabling seamless collaboration across your organization's key financial workflows. Best of all, Planful grows with you. Its unmatched scalability ensures that no matter how fast your business expands, Planful can keep up. See why over 1,500 customers worldwide choose Planful as their flexible, user-friendly, end-to-end financial performance management platform. Visit planful.com/metrics to see how you can elevate your team this year with Planful. They will hook you up. It is planful.com/metrics. Tell them your boy CJ sent you. Planful.com/metrics. Matt, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, sir. Glad to be here.
You are, you're mysterious to me because you were a product manager and somehow someone steered you wrong and you ended up on the dark side with me.
I mean, yeah, certainly my path has not been traditional. My career actually started off in finance. I started off at Google, joined a rotation program out of college for there. But oftentimes when I'm talking to folks coming out of school or even folks in their 30s or 40s, and I get to the inevitable question of what do you want to be when you grow up? I always preface it with them of I have never had a good answer to that question.
Yeah.
And I still don't. So I think I've often just followed the path of follow good teams, follow good problems. It happened to be that I started off following up stuff in finance. I took a little bit of break for 15 years. In the last 2 years, it's been back into finance, but not the traditional path by any means.
Because you've been a product manager, and we'll really dig into this, but at Google, YouTube, and then the first PM at Coda. Can you just talk more specifically about your journey to CFO? Because how do you make the jump from like the person who's saying this is how we build stuff to like this is how we budget for stuff? And also now I'm like the CFO. I'm the head budget guy.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of that has to do with what it's like starting a company. So I was part of the founding team at Coda, and like my journey at Google and YouTube maybe is more helpful to go through. I've always been the numbers guy.
Oh.
Within finance at Google, I was in a rotation program to start off, which was wonderful to go into out of undergrad in the sense that it gives you a flavor of different parts of finance. So my first role or my first rotation in it was 9 months in compliance, which was not particularly fun for me, but still good.
That must have felt like 9 years, 9 months in compliance.
I mean, my job back then was looking at 2 contracts, one that we sent to the customer and the one that came back, and making sure they were the same, that like nothing was crossed out.
Really?
And like once it was good, it was my job to go execute the contract. Like I'd sign it on behalf of our head of sales or whatever. And that was very not challenging, but it gave me lots of time to like learn stuff. So I learned to code, learned to do all sorts of stuff during that time. Anyways, where I was headed was always been data oriented, started off in that compliance role. And then I did a role on this team called Rev Team, which was basically like a quant team or a data science team within the finance world, which was very different in the sense of everything else that was going on within Google Finance. And that team partnered super closely with product. And that's kind of where I got my first taste of what it's like to work with product managers, to work with engineers. That pushed me into a role eventually where I was responsible for the YouTube revenue line. And I was like the quant guy on YouTube revenue, doing predictive modeling and whatnot. And I met all of the YouTube PMs, the monetization crew, and then I ended up going into monetization or going into product management that way through that team. And it was a very useful, good experience, which leads to Coda, which was when we started the company, there were 6 of us. You don't really need the finance guy if you've got funding and you're trying to build software. So I spent those first 3.5, 4 years on the product side, work with our developer and design team to build out the studs of what is the product today. And then spent the next 4 years or 5 years after that building out the go-to-market team. And then really once we got to the end of 2021, beginning of 2022, I could feel the tides turning in terms of the market and the economy. Knew I wanted to be closer to the purse strings and what was happening with our bank accounts. And I felt like I had gotten the go-to-market team into a good shape in terms of leadership. They had good functional leadership in place. And it was a good moment for me to go back to my more analytical roots.
Listening to you go through this journey, regardless of whatever department we call it, finance, sales ops, product, like you always found a way to be in the way of the money. And what I mean by that is you were very close to the monetization efforts, it sounds like. Yeah,
I mean, revenue has always been near and dear to me. I think one of the early CFOs at Google, this guy, Patrick Bichette, he was the second one that I was there for my time at Google. He would use this phrase of revenue growth solves all problems. If you think of the budgeting process, you think of headcount planning, you think of everything, it all starts at what's your revenue line. So just in terms of where you get the most leverage out of what things to go explore from an analytical perspective, revenue is like the obvious thing you go deep dive on and understand really deeply. When you think about like sophisticated financial models, the best ones are always starting on they did something clever in revenue and they have like a unique way to think about levers and drivers and that kind of stuff.
Well, that's an amazing segue because I reached out to my friend Lenny Rachitsky and I said, hey, I know you do a lot of work with Coda. Can you give me 1 or 2 questions that I can ask Matt, who's coming on the podcast? And he said, you got to ask him about this thing called blue and black loops. So I don't know where this is actually going to go, but can you break that down for me?
Yeah, I mean, Lenny's great. We actually just hosted one of his conferences, or we worked with him for one of his conferences last week. Yeah, so blue and black loops, where do I start on this? So this was the way, especially back in 2018, 2019, as we were starting to come out of stealth and into market with Coda, it was the way we really thought about the growth of the business. So this is all pre-revenue. It's when I was running the growth and go-to-market team. And basically what it represented was Coda itself is a collaborative tool. Think of it like Google Docs, Google spreadsheets, databases, the best parts of applications, and all mushed into one all-in-one surface. That by nature, it's in the browser, it's got a URL, is very shareable. If you think about like anytime you've built a financial model or written a document, you, the maker, write the document, do the thing, make the model, and then you share it with a big group of people. In the blue and black loop framework, we call that just the traditional like Microsoft Office loop or the doc loop, where you have a maker come in, they build a document. After they've made their doc, they share it with their team, and then some portion of their team is going to trickle in and build their own doc and share it with a new group of people and whatnot. There's actually some visualizations that we posted online about this back when we launched pricing back in 2019 that showcase some of this like graph behavior. If you think of like a network visualization, it shows like the maker, who they shared it with, and what people made docs out of that or whatnot. And you see these different structures of teams. So this is all the black loop. It's the traditional like growth loop for collaborative tools. The blue loop is sometimes we call it the YouTube loop. And this was from the observation that after you've built a really great doc, like, and then you want to make a template out of it or whatnot, you can publish it to the world. And that becomes a kind of like a content loop. Now people who are searching for a specific point solution, how do I split costs with friends or track strategic investors or something like that, will go Google that thing and then find this Coda doc that someone has already pre-made, copy it, and now they can go use it. So you have these like two reinforcing loops where one is about spread within teams and the other one is about spread across teams. Maybe tying this back to our conversation a moment ago and like revenue modeling and whatnot. Back in 2019, this was the way we modeled the business, and it was all usage modeling. So it wasn't like a financial model, it was a growth model.
Wow.
And it was measuring out all the parts of the black and blue loop. And like we would look at, cohorts of users, see what their spread rates are, and then you can mathematically go compute, all right, if we're acquiring this many users at this rate from these spots, this is what our DAUs or MAUs will look like, N months out or whatnot.
That's brilliant. Was this something that you mapped out inherent to Coda itself because you knew that it was shareable by nature, or is this a framework that's been used at other companies that had network effects?
I mean, I think there are certainly patterns where this is like somewhat of a common, like you think I mentioned content loop, like that's a very common like growth concept or whatnot. And I mentioned the black loop. It's like patterned off of collaborative tools. Almost all collaborative tools will have a loop that looks like that, unless there's not that third step where like editors become makers themselves. Mm-hmm. So if you think of like maybe a design tool like Figma, if you share your design with a set of folks, it's not likely that everyone becomes a designer. So you have to now go build out like a different product suite to go attack. All right, what are the tools that are going to be relevant for them? For us, it's horizontal. So it could be any scenario where it applies.
This is really neat. I have a friend, his name is Ben Williams. He was the VP of product growth at Sneak, a cybersecurity company that I worked at with a heavy PLG motion. And he would describe these growth loops to me. And I was like a finance guy who didn't have too much experience talking to product people. But I was like, this is brilliant because I'm obsessed with CAC payback period over here. And you're describing a way that we can get users that actually go and get us more users.
I mean, I think it's funny because since my career has bounced between finance and product and data science and whatnot, all of them carry the same thread of this ability to go model a thing. Mm-hmm. And I think that's like an area where people in finance don't totally recognize. If you're a model builder, if you're on the FP&A side, this is as applicable, like that skill set is as applicable to modeling out user growth and thinking about acquisition loops and whatever, as it is, doing a P&L or doing a build on budgets or whatnot. It's all the same building blocks. And
it is. This may be an off the wall question, but like when you're starting out, are you a bit scared about like what the assumptions are going to be in one of these things? Because like it's probably hard to calibrate it first.
I mean, yeah, the main insight you get out of all of them is sensitivity. Like you start to develop a deeper understanding of sensitivity and historical tracking to see like when cohorts turned or whatnot. But you're absolutely right that it is exceedingly easy to make very large numbers by multiplying them all together. Yeah. And inputs matter, a ton. It's funny. You'll often, someone who's not attuned to a lot of the spreadsheet world or any of this stuff will look at these things and say, oh, that's a quantitative model. Like it must be like it's science. And the reality is it's like 95% art of what the output is because it's all about what inputs you put in there. And like, yes, you want good judgment, but at the end of the day, you're like picking your levers to make it move the way you want. versus it being like a, purely statistical exercise.
This reminds me a bit of a conversation that we had with Lily Yang, the CFO of Strava. So I'm obsessed with Strava, the ability to track your runs and biking and stuff. And they have a ton of free users, but then there's also this social aspect to it where, you get people who you're friends with to join it. And she described some of these loops, but then you have to figure out how to forecast for it in your model and how to budget for like free versus paid users.
Totally. I mean, it's funny. So backing up earlier in my career, that team that I kind of cut my cloth on in finance, it was called Rev Team, but that was like the predictive analytics group. And on that group, when it was early, I worked with YouTube when it was 90 million in revenue, all the way up to when it had 3 billion in revenue. So it was like a big growth turn during that period. And early on, a lot of the modeling was done as like a traditional spreadsheet based finance model. It's because you're trying to understand drivers, and it's about sensitivity and understanding those sensitivities. But after you got to scale, the thing to predict no longer was the drivers. The thing to predict was just the absolute revenue line and producing a time series forecast on it. So kind of back to that example of, what are you going to use to set the top line revenue budget? It kind of depends on what part of the phase of the company or product you're in. If it's early, you have the driver model to understand levers and where to place investments and whatever. If it's later, you want predictability. And then you're shifting to a time series based model where you're just basically predicting year-on-year growth rates or something like that to have as accurate of a model as possible, not one that's explainable. That's
so true. Because eventually you get to a point where it's like 3 lefts can make a right as long as the top line revenue number is right.
That's right. And like it can move, you can end up being wrong on three of the levers and then one totally outperforms or whatever. And that's useful to know, but that doesn't necessarily mean your prediction is any more accurate. And if like revenue is being used to set budget or it's being used to set hiring targets or whatever, like you just want it as accurate as possible, not explainable at that phase.
You're a very data-driven guy. I love this. Are you obsessed with looking at things within your model based on user cohorts?
Absolutely. At some point you drill down far enough and it ends up just becoming stories.
Oh, say more about that. That's powerful.
Just in the sense that like, maybe I'll flash forward a couple of years. So we had this black and blue model for those first couple of years. It was largely around usage projections, not as much revenue. That was pre-monetization for us. After monetization, you start to look at a lot of the same cuts. It's cohort baits of customers, understanding which one's growing more, looking at NDR across them or whatnot. And once you start looking at like one of those individual cells, like, oh, cohort, from Q4 of 2022 is growing at 130%. Let me dig into that. Oh, it's one customer. Like there's one customer that's just totally killing it and everyone else is pretty even. Rarely do you end up seeing like the whole groups are moving, in unison together, up or down. It's often, there's a couple specific stories. Oh, that company went out of business. Oh, that company they started off on 10 seats and now they're at 1,000 and went wall to wall. That's the whole cohort. So that's kind of what I mean by it becomes a narrative or a story at some point. And the more you drill in, I actually don't think it takes very much to get into one of those individual stories in a lot of these cohorts because the numbers like NDR or year-on-year growth rate are so sensitive to the small marginal movements with an individual customer.
Hey, thanks for listening. We'll be right back after a word from our sponsors. Does your revenue recognition process feel like a total guessing game? Step right up and pick a card, any card. You're not alone. Revenue accounting is getting more complex, especially with subscription models, usage-based billing, and evolving compliance standards. Woohoo! RightRev is here to help you gain control over your revenue accounting. RightRev automates the revenue recognition process from end to end. Whether it's multi-element arrangements, subscription renewals, or complex usage-based contracts, RightRev takes care of it all. That means fewer spreadsheets, fewer errors, and more time for your team to focus on growth. Customers like Snowflake, Logic Monitor, and Epicor chose RightRev to manage their high volume and complex revenue accounting. CFOs can see the bigger picture faster without being held up by their team's reporting nightmares. You know me, I'm a business model fanatic. And don't get me wrong, I love all the evolutions. We've got self-serve revenue, usage-based revenue, and now even success-based revenue, you name it. But that doesn't make it any easier for us being counters on the back end to keep score. RightRev is like a cheat code for staying ahead of revenue complexities. So you're ready to transform your revenue accounting? Visit RightRev.com to schedule a demo. That's RightRev.com and tell them your boy CJ sent you. RightRev, modern revenue recognition simplified. Oh yeah. I've made that mistake multiple times, Matt, with ARPU, so average revenue per user, where I drill in and I'm like, oh man, this cohort is absolutely crushing it. It's really just like one big customer, or we had so few customers at the time that actually somebody left and one stuck around that subsidized all the rest. So on the surface, you think it's healthy, but you're actually churning customers.
I mean, the data set that everyone uses, and I feel like is at the top of anyone that works in SaaS in particular, that's on the top of their list of stuff they look at and care about, is pipeline. And this, in my mind, is like the best example, because it's no longer is it just like ARPU of how much they paid. It's like a salesperson's estimate of what the pipe is worth. And now it's like, all right, you've got two totally different dimensions that interplay at things like, what's your average close rate? Or like, what's the typical deal size? Or, whatever. And it's like, boy, the number of small things that can move all of these numbers a lot is immensely wide. Just because I worked on that quantitative team back in the Google days, a lot of my analysis toolkit is in a spreadsheet. I often use R, and in particular use this visualization library called ggplot, which is fantastic. But in it, it allows you to very simply or very easily plot both the underlying data and like statistical things on top of it. So you can plot like average deal size. I'll plot it, and then I'll show like, the average, and then with confidence bands, the 95% bands. And it's like, there is not a moment in at least our history where it's been statistically significant, the movement in average deal size, because there's so much spread. And if you go drill into any one of the dots, it moved the whole thing up or down. Anyways, I just feel like we often report on that all the time. Oh, deals are getting shorter, they're getting longer. Well, in reality, this one deal got shorter and that one deal over there was really long. But there's not really a meaningful trend yet.
Well, something that plays into everything that we're talking about here is how you price something. Are you pricing it to move? Are you pricing it to expand over time? Can you talk about how your pricing model at Coda has evolved over time?
There's a little bit of a deeper story on it, in the sense that we raised money back in 2014. We're in lockdown stealth for the first couple of years, building out the studs of the product, doing user research or whatnot. So we really didn't launch our 1.0 until 2019. Like, it took a while for us to get the full frame that we wanted in. And when we launched it, it was partly under the guise of we wanted good user feedback. We were at the point where we felt like we had planted all the flags in the core parts of the product in terms of features and what it was meant to be. But we didn't put monetization on that list. We said in the beginning it was free. And that created maybe like two different challenges for us. The first one was you end up in these situations, especially at market, where you want to go work with an enterprise, and it being free means that there's like a commitment block. Like, they don't feel like it's quite as serious, or they're not sure, like, am I going to start using this and you're going to charge me like $5 million on the other side of this? So they want like some certainty in a contract. So that maybe the first thing I'd say on pricing is, in the beginning, we didn't have any. And in retrospect, I'd say that made go-to-market a lot harder, because it's harder to get to the question of, is this worth, X dollars to you, without having a dollar amount on it. There was a founder that I was working with back in the day who, before they had built anything related to monetization, put a price on their landing page for no other reason than it led to conversation. And then when people signed up for it, they didn't bill them. They just didn't charge them. But the customers knew what it was going to be, and they waited 6 months before they built it all or sent them an invoice. But it was kind of like fake it till you make it. So they got some signal on what was the price going to be.
And you don't know what people really think about you until they actually have to drop a credit card down. Like, I could ask my mom, like, hey, what do you think of this podcast? And she's like, oh, honey, it's great. But then I'm like, Mom, it costs you $5 a month. She's like, well, I'm proud of you, but I'm probably not going to pay for that. Yeah.
She'd pay for that for sure. But I think that's right. I think the moment it's a non-zero dollar amount, now it's like a totally different value equation.
Right.
Anyway, so like the Coda pricing story, so it started off as free. I'd say that was kind of a tough learning. After that, we kind of followed a lot of the same patterns that you see in both SaaS and even recently with AI stuff. Where in the beginning, we kind of made a message to ourselves, which was we didn't want to innovate in pricing. We wanted, like, we have got plenty of innovation in the product. We want this part to be dead simple. And where we ended up was a little bit different, in the sense that we ended up launching with this thing called Maker Billing, which, going back to the analogy I was given before about, one person builds a spreadsheet and then shares it with their team. The thing we really didn't want to have happen was, if you built out something in Coda and then you went to the share button, we didn't want there to be a dollar sign next to that share button. We didn't want you to have to like share it with your team. And then when you did that, have to choose like, who on my team gets a paid license? Like, does everyone have to pay to be able to see this thing I just built or whatever? So at least the part of the innovation in our pricing model was you only pay for the doc maker. You only pay for that first person that built it all. But if you wanted to go build a great tracker or a great app or whatnot in Coda, and then you shared it with your team, the rest of your team doesn't have to pay for Coda to go use the thing. Obviously, that was back in 2019 that we launched this all. And actually, I'll maybe make a small statement of our very first iteration of it had some mathematical cuteness in it, which in retrospect was stupid. And then we ended up addressing it, relatively quickly after launch. And since then, we made all sorts of small tweaks to it. Like when we started to move even further up market and work with large enterprises that had deployed pretty broadly with Coda, now we've got, a little bit more keen to employee-based pricing, or site-wide licenses, when they don't want to be in that position of who gets what seat and like have to jockey with it at all. And then really the last 2 years, it's been somewhat required some iteration again with the launch of AI and all the AI stuff. So we've got a bunch of different AI services within Coda, and that's got a part of it baked into the user license, but then a part of its usage. So if you end up going over, you end up paying credits, and now it's like a hybrid between both seat-based and usage-based billing.
So now you get the recurring plus the reoccurring.
That's right. That's the idea. That's right.
Because a lot of companies out there have this challenge. And we were talking to Kyle Poyer. He writes Growth Unhinged, and he's a venture capitalist who writes about pricing and packaging a lot. It's like, how do you sell a new AI feature? Do you make it already part of the package that you're selling? So if it's $20, maybe it goes up to $25, or do you make it so it's $20 and then plus a $5 AI module? Or do you make it's the $20 plus, 50 cents per, case resolved or something like that? And it sounds like you went the way of, correct me if I'm wrong, that there's a base price. And then if you want to add AI features, it's another piece on top of that.
There's a part that's baked into it, and I'd say most users don't end up hitting that limit. Maybe the broader advice I'd try to push is, we were talking a little bit about fluid black loops a moment ago and how Coda spreads within teams or whatnot. A lot of people think of their pricing model as being separate from the core feature or usage of it. I would say they are exactly the same thing. Your monetization model needs to map as close to customer value as possible. Otherwise, you end up with inefficiencies. Unused seats, or maybe to pick an example, if it's usage-based billing, I will use it exactly the amount I value for it, since I'm paying for it a la carte every single time.
Yeah.
But it's like very aligned that way, with the exception of, now back up for a moment. If you've asked anyone on spending habits, if you have to spend for something every time you do it, you end up buying less. So you want to find like the right middle ground, where it's like a subscription where you get a lot of value for it. You're happy with that value. There's some usage-based aspect to it, but perhaps it's not, inhibitive of spend or of your willingness to purchase. It just depends.
That makes sense. And I like how you said it's intimately part of the product. And it sounds like you've built Coda very intentionally to be that way. The way that maker billing works is very intuitive from a product-led growth motion too, because you don't want to create this friction that makes it harder for people to get value out of it. Because it's kind of like, if you spread your surface area for good things to happen and provide value, people will eventually pay you for it. And I think that's part of the promise that PLG has had. Do you think there's any part of PLG that's overly romanticized? Is there any downside to PLG?
Oh, certainly. I mean, I feel like I was fortunate in the sense that I got to I got to see a lot of what today we'd consider PLG type stuff at YouTube. And consumer is really where you see the level of detail and like the very specific mechanics that matter, because consumers, the price is zero for many of them. So if there is friction, the value is somewhat small compared to a business application. So they'll like just go if you got it wrong. So you get very clear signal. PLG in software, like software as a service in particular, I think has kind of gone through, ironically right now, I'd say it's kind of out of...
is it out of vogue? I don't know.
Yeah, I just don't feel like it's definitely not the cool thing to talk about these days. But even when it was, I feel like it was like the smart money in the room knew that it was a tool in your toolkit, but it was not the end all be all. As an example, when we talk about down market customers in Coda, or folks that are small companies, PLG matters 100% for them. That's kind of where it all comes together. You got to make sure that works. Up market, you start talking about complex flows, and oftentimes we'd go into teams, like maybe I'll pick product management teams for a moment. You go into some of those teams, you're trying to sell them software. The thing that they need help with is not software. They don't need help like setting up the tool. What they need help is, how do I run my team? How should I do product road mapping? Like, I don't know. And at least the core thesis we've always had is that it's kind of different company to company, team to team. Yes, there are some playbooks and patterns you can follow, but in a lot of cases, you need the process that fits well for your culture, for the leadership team you have in place, and for the individuals you have in your team. And that's why you want a somewhat flexible tool like Coda to go do it, building on the best practices of whatever other teams. Most traditional software, you'd go in and it's codified into the tool. It's like Jira has a very specific opinion of how you do project management and task tracking for engineers. And it's like, you kind of get two options. Do you want the backlog, or do you want to do it Scrum or Agile? Like, pick your path, and that's it. And like, you have to kind of follow that path or that thing. Back to the PLG comment and start talking about moving up market and where PLG fails. It's always in these cases where it's the altitude of conversation is not about the tool. It's about, how do I go change this business process or improve this part of my company or my team, which is a collaborative sale. It's a consultative sale, not one that's just product led.
I've also seen it fail when people are using your product in a way that it was never intended to be used. And maybe that's not as much of a problem because Coda is so flexible, but I don't know if that resonates at all.
I mean, it certainly, interestingly, I'd say, having managed a sales team before, that level of variety is even worse. Like, if product-led growth is useful, the product can go sell itself or whatnot, and you need sales-led to go in to handle the complex sales and do this, consultative approach. For a salesperson, if a customer is using the tool in a way that you have not been trained on whatsoever, now that's even more blocking. Now you're not really sure how to support them. You don't really know if you want to include this in your conversations with procurement or IT. It just puts you in a little bit of a bind. You haven't been enabled on that use case or that scenario. So in that world, I'd argue that PLG is actually even more favorable, because you're not limited by what has to go through a relatively intense sales training process.
Right. It does sound like you found a happy medium, and maybe it's not, the word isn't happy medium, but an honest medium where you know when you need a sales team to step in and like, hey, the skids have been greased. You can pick it up from this point, and it's probably a higher probability sale now.
Yeah, I think that's right. And like, it's probably simpler if you went and asked someone who's coming into this all fresh, and you said, how would you pick? They'd probably say, firmographically. And you'd be like, oh, that's smart. Yeah, that's about right. The other approach that we haven't really talked about yet, which maybe back to like, is PLG not in vogue anymore? Mm-hmm. The replacement I might give is like community-led growth or like community-driven growth.
And is that different or the same?
I think it's different, because like product-led growth, I view it as that is innate in the software. It's self-evident enough. The product just does it. Versus sales-led, you're bringing in someone from the company to help coach you through it. And community is, we are a bunch of users that have no relation to each other than we use the same product, and we support each other to get this thing done or build this thing or learn best practices or whatnot. And in that world, I'd say that works very well for like the heterogeneous, lots of use cases. Here's this wild thing that I've done. How would you do it? I think community does a really nice job supporting that kind of thing, versus sales doesn't, because it's like, I haven't been enabled on that, so I don't know what to do.
Yeah. Someone once said to me, is it really product-led growth if I can't pay with a credit card? And I was like, I think you're missing the forest through the trees here. The whole point is to get a sale done faster and for less money.
Honestly, the billing mechanism and all of this, I feel like we've kind of gotten hung up on this a few times internally. Billing mechanism is completely orthogonal. If I could, I would have every single customer on automatic billing no matter what. That sounds delightful. It's mostly a question of how much engineering effort did I have to go spend doing stuff to get everything automatically billed.
Right. We were building a budget recently, and we were saying, oh, this part of the product should sell itself. Like, this should be an on-ramp. In fact, like, a salesperson shouldn't need to touch it. And then someone in FP&A was like, so you're saying that you're giving a quota to the product team essentially? And I'm like, well, no. Well, I guess I kind of am, but I don't know how to quantify that in my model.
Yeah. We could do a whole hour on comp structures and like, how do you think about compensating different functions or whatnot? A big part of whether the juice is worth the squeeze on manual billing versus automatic comes back to, well, practically, how does this work in the system? Like, if I'm a salesperson, the thing I really like about manual billing is it gives me a moment to drive the sale towards. I want ink on paper right here. And this is how
it's a compelling event.
That's right. On the flip side, like, automatic billing does not work that way. So like, part of it is they're not asking for it. And like kind of going back to comp structures and stuff, it also gives you very clear things that you can go and like, put values on and do stuff with. If it's automatic, it's like, oh, well, they added a seat, they removed a seat. It's kind of going up and down all the time. You have to predict that and like somehow make that.
And I have less control.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
That's awesome. That's the inside baseball people love coming to the pod for us. Thanks for that.
Yeah.
We're going to explore brave new territory here, and that's bringing a PM mentality to finance. And so, as we stated before, you were a product manager at Google, YouTube, and then the first founding PM at Coda. What are the biggest misconceptions about product managers?
I mean, this is a broad topic in the sense that product management as a category is very diverse. Like, you go company to company, they treat product managers differently. It's probably not too different for like FP&A or if you're a controller. Like that's kind of this. It's kind of similar of just like expectations and whatnot between companies. Product managers, at least where I've been at Google, at YouTube, that's kind of where I saw the model for me up close. And within that business, they were kind of like the GMs who were the P&L owners. It was them or the engineering manager, just depended on the product line. Maybe to pick an example, one of my close friends, she was a brand manager at Clorox. And at Clorox, the P&L owner was not the product manager. It was not the product person. It was the brand manager. Like brand mattered there first and foremost. So going back to like my experiences with it and how to think about product managers broadly as like a finance counterpart, I think you have to make an assessment of what kind of organization are we in first to know like what it's like working with them. So from here on out, I'll describe it as like you're working with the person that's the P&L owner or like the GM. And for that, maybe the other dimension on this, if the first dimension is company culture and like what product managers are responsible for, the second one is about their archetypes. Like what kind of person are they? And we've always, in like recruiting or whatnot, we've always described product managers along 4 different buckets. One of them being, and it's defined a little bit of how they start their day. So the first kind of product manager is the strategy-oriented product manager. They wake up every morning and they read their one-pager that's like about product strategy, how they're positioning themselves. It's the SWOT table. They're just thinking about the industry, the dynamic. The second product manager is the designer. So this is like the person that wakes up and they stare at the mock. They want to look at all the pixels and think about the experiences and the flows. The third product manager is like the taskmaster. They wake up and they look at the to-do list. They're looking at the statuses and looking at the backlog, mapping out their timeline and roadmap. And then the fourth one ends up being like the dashboard person. They wake up and they go straight to the dashboard. How's usage? How's telemetry? All 4 of them are great. All 4 of them can be world-class product managers, but they all have a very different hat on. And if I was interacting with them in a finance capacity, I approach them all super differently. You don't go to the mock product manager with your model, although you're a good complement to it. You probably want to collaborate really closely with the dashboard product manager on the inputs to the model, the levers, how it's built. You're probably working hand in hand in the same desk. It all goes back to approach and understanding who you're working with. They can be pretty different.
That's critical because a lot of times as finance people, we just group people into departments, right? Like, oh, that's the product team. But it seems like there are very, very diverse tactical ways to work with product managers, depending on which of those buckets they're in.
That's right. I mean, at the end of the day, if I were to back up and think about partnering, and I'd extend this beyond just product managers, since I've worked on the sales side, marketing side, et cetera, what a lot of people look for in counterparts and cross-functional counterparts is not just, I think finance has a persona that's often the referee. You're the numbers person. You're kind of tracking
the referee progress. Or the umpire.
Yeah, which can be nice and like that's needed. But I will guess that if you go ask any cross-functional counterpart, they'll say they'd prefer a partner over a referee every day of the week. Mm-hmm. And I think figuring out how to keep your referee or umpire hat on, but figure out how to partner in a way that's driving business value is very, very different. And what separates folks that are really good as cross-functional partners versus folks that are great at it.
That's awesome. This ties in to both sides of your brain here. It's building something versus buying something. How do you choose whether you should build something yourself or buy a tool at Coda?
Man, I'm probably like the worst person to ask for this.
I feel like you build a lot of stuff. That's just my
I 100% build a lot. I am like a heavy builder. I will try to answer this balanced though.
Did you build the CRM? Be honest with me, Matt.
Our first one, absolutely. It was called Go Customers.
Did you really?
Oh yeah, absolutely. We had some SQL that jammed it into a table. You'd take notes in it. It would send out notes to everyone. It was great. But then I had a conversation with a friend of mine who's ran various sales teams in software companies. And his comment to me was, teaching a salesperson how to use this custom bespoke CRM is like useful in that job. It is not transferable. Teaching anyone how to use Salesforce is a good skill set to learn as a salespeople for their career. And even though I was very hesitant and reluctant to do it, that's what we ended up committing to.
There are a lot of companies having this debate, though. It's like, especially with AI, I think, was it Klarna had recently said that they're getting rid of Salesforce as their CRM and Workday as their HRIS.
They had rebuilt their own CRM internally. That's right.
First, I don't know if I believe it. It may just be like an easy way to get away with firing people and, getting rid of a vendor. But like, you don't get like extra credit points for doing that, right? Like that's not your core competency.
No, and I think that's exactly where like the rational person will make a good argument on this. So like the rational person argument of build versus buy is you go and look at cost versus benefit. You look at resource allocation. You think about if it's core to your business or not. But at the end of the day, I just don't think it ends up being that simple. Maybe to back up and describe like a broader leadership lesson I'd give to this. Imagine a team really wanted to build a tool, like an internal tool for themselves that you could have bought off the shelf, but they really want to do it. There is not a good leader that will say, tough, you are going to buy this thing and you are not going to go build that thing and get back to work like it's over. Like that'll just never fly. They'll begrudgingly take the tool. They won't like it very much. They'll be mopey about it. Like that's just bad. It's just not going to be effective leadership. When I was at YouTube, there was actually this team, data engineering team that built their own workflow software. Workflows for, it's basically like task management, but for code. So there's like, a job that you have to go run, a status for it. You can have jobs depend on jobs or whatever. There's probably 1,000 pieces of commercial or packaged software you could go buy that did this thing, but they wanted to build their own and there was no kind of getting them off of it. And the reason is because if you go buy any of this software, you end up down two paths. The first one is facing what is like the axiom of software, which is you want to build the largest common denominator product that you can then have as big of a market as possible, people using the same features or whatever. But the reality is for any individual customer, there's going to be a bunch of features they don't need. And there's going to be like two things they really wanted that's not there. So the argument to build is you can build it exactly how you want it and not get all the other crap that comes with it. So it's just tricky. Maybe to give like the way that I evaluate this now at Coda, we've got like a little bit of it's not a joke, but it's like
build it in Coda. Is that the joke? Like when someone comes to you for budget,
do lots of that, and
you're like, I've given you the tools, dude.
We certainly do lots of that because it's easy, it's quick. It's as quick as building a spreadsheet. You can make a tool that's as powerful as an app. But the rule I was going to give was we call it the vacation rule.
What's that?
And it comes from one of our executives was on vacation with his family. And it was kind of raining out. They were all they were supposed to go do X, Y, and Z. They couldn't do it. So they kind of went around the room of what do you want to go do? And everyone was mopey. No one wanted to do anything. No one liked someone else's idea. So it just kind of turned into like a ho-hum experience. And then they decided like, okay, this sucks. Sitting inside all day, all being kind of negative. We have a new rule, which is we're going to go do whatever the most enthusiastic person wants to do. So that like eliminates the debate. Whoever's most excited, we're going to go do your thing. So go get excited. So like this build versus buy thing, honestly, that's kind of my approach now. It's kind of like vacation rule. Whoever's most excited gets to make the decision. It's easy at a place like Coda where at least you can go build the doc versus if it was like, I'm going to go build, a React app that I have to go stand up somewhere. It's like, okay, well, that sounds like it's going to be hard. And maybe you're not the person that's going to go do it, but it certainly makes that debate a lot easier.
Yeah, well, maybe this is a similar question. And first of all, I love the vacation rule. I'm definitely stealing that. But your company, you integrate with a ton of different tools and you pull data from all different places. As a CFO, how do you think about SaaS Sprawl?
Yeah, I mean, that definitely goes back to like the build versus buy thing. I don't feel like we end up having a hard problem with it because so much of stuff at Coda is built within Coda. Like a lot of our culture was hiring makers. So we don't quite have SaaS Sprawl, but we certainly have Doc Sprawl. But that's kind of the nice part about at least what we do in the sense that if you think about retiring a doc, like a Google Doc or a spreadsheet, that's not a big deal. Retiring a piece of software is a huge deal. So for us, it's kind of like low cost to spin up and low cost to retire. So it's like okay to have a little bit of Doc Sprawl as we figure out which model or which thing really fits with us. Maybe to back up, the advice that I end up giving to folks often starts from the place of like trust your team.
Right.
You have to trust the person that's in the arena to like make a judgment call of do they need a tool or not. That said, maybe I'd say I've got a couple controls that I use. Maybe the most practical control for some of your audience would be, this is going to be super, it's going to be super obvious in retrospect.
I'm excited.
I've wired up a Coda doc, which is a list of all of our software vendors, their renewal dates, how much they're for, or whatnot. And then in that same Coda doc, I've got another table that's connected to our Snowflake instance that's a query for every single one of the domains of the software vendors that we use that goes and pulls their usage stats on Coda. So then I can join those two things in Coda and then get a list. I have two lists. I have software vendors that use Coda and software vendors that don't use Coda. And I kind of know which one I'm focusing on when it comes renewal time. And like, I'll go press the team of like, that one, like it's at the top of my bad list. Like, I don't know, versus the good list. It's like, okay, great. We're getting value out of them or whatever. And like the numbers all map out. We end up spending way more with vendors that on like a per vendor basis of vendors that are
wallet share
as well. Yeah.
I love that. That's strategic. That's like truly thinking about how you partner with vendors and customers. I love that.
Totally. I mean, and for us too, a lot of it comes back to some of those same vendors are ones that we have packs or integrations with. So there's like, they're not just vendors for us, but they're also our partners because we've got integrations with them that people then use in Coda or whatnot.
Yeah.
The second control I was going to give you was, again, this is like biased internally for Coda. Because of those integrations, it often means that for a lot of those tools, we don't need as many licenses. So it's certainly the case that we have an engineering team that uses Jira. The whole company does not need access to Jira, but the whole company does want to know about status from Jira. So we can pull, those tickets and those things into a Coda doc that everyone has access to, but it doesn't require everyone getting a license. So we end up seeing a lot smaller footprints across a lot of these tools, just from a seat count perspective, since we're like integrating them into one common tool that we all use.
That's awesome. Thanks for taking me through that. I want to talk a bit about frameworks. You're a frameworks guy. It seems like the way that you think through everything. I can't pronounce this word, but I want to know more about it. Eigenquestions. What are these?
Eigenquestion. Nailed it. Yeah, that was good.
I did? Okay. Wow.
Yeah. I mean, I think I'm certainly a systems thinker. I like thinking about how things fit together, how things work. Eigenquestions, maybe to give the definition really short up front, it basically means that you should focus on the most important question or decision that is going to lead to, a bunch of other decisions or effective decision making, basically. So some of this goes back to Coda history or Coda lore. In the early days, it was me and 500 other individuals, the CEO, 3 engineers, and the woman that was running a lot of our operations work. And the office itself was wall-to-wall whiteboards. So we had gotten like wallpaper and put whiteboards up on every single wall. And it was like a big, 30 foot by 20 foot rectangle. So we had lots of whiteboard space. And me and the CEO are both like, whiteboard enthusiasts, I guess I'd say.
Yeah.
And we came up with our own kind of color codes to like map out problems and draw out UIs and whatnot. And it led to, a set of patterns. Like black represents the main questions. Blue represented options. So here's the question. Here are a bunch of options for it. We used gray or brown to like draw up little examples where you look at the option, be able to see a picture of it and understand it. We'd use purple to do call outs, like that represented action or choices within that picture. And then we'd be able to color code all the options, like red is bad, green is good. And we'd use orange to kind of highlight where we're leaning. And that would lead to every day we would basically do a product review. We'd like walk along the whiteboards and go through the things that each of us had drawn up with the engineering team.
Whoa.
And we'd like look at them and you could very quickly see the space. You'd like, okay, these are all the key questions. Here are the options within each one. This is where Matt's leaning. And like, you could just digest it within, a minute rather than it being like a 2-hour, product review session. And Eigenquestion ended up becoming which of these questions, like those black questions, were the ones that would answer all the other ones. And that became the Eigenquestion. It's like, all right, we're looking at this space. This is the one question we have to go answer to get answers to the rest of it. Maybe to give you an example, one of our interview questions for product managers for a long time was a situational, where it's imagine you're working with a set of friends who come to you and they've developed a teleportation device. And this allows you to teleport something anywhere in the world. Ask them questions. Like they want you to come and like run the company behind it or whatnot. And normally a candidate will like start just listing off stuff. And the next prompt is actually the engineers are kind of tired of working with you. They're going to give you 2 questions. So you have to come up with 2 questions to ask that will basically determine your go-to-market strategy for this thing. And as an example of this like teleportation question, the 2 questions, you could pick a bunch of different ones, but like 2 examples would be, how much does it cost to do this? Like, does it cost more to operationally run the machine, or does it cost a lot to build the machine? So that's like one question. And like those are kind of like the options. And then the other question is it safe? Can you put humans in it, or is it only good for like physical goods? Mm-hmm. And like with those 2 questions, you can basically draw like broad options of your go-to-market. If it's CapEx heavy and not safe, you've got like a bulk inventory shipper. You basically become
your FedEx.
It's a freight company. If it's operationally expensive but not safe, now you're a fax machine. Now you're going to send lots of small stuff. Everyone's going to have one in their home, that kind of thing. If it's safe but large, now you're safe but big investment. Now you're an airport. Now you're going to be like a major transportation hub. And if it's safe but small, well, now this is like, your teleporters and every house or whatever. Anyways, this is just like an example of how Eigenquestions, you have to like distill a whole problem space down to like the one part that really matters. And then you can figure everything out.
That's really cool. It's somewhat tangential, but Sam Zell, he basically invented the real estate investment trust, the REIT. And he was a deal guy. And someone once taught him that in any deal, there's basically only one thing that matters. And it's your job to figure out within that deal that you're negotiating what that one point is.
Yeah. I think that's great.
Next one. I was snooping around on PitchBook for you guys, and I noticed that Mamoon, Hamid of Kleiner Perkins and Reid Hoffman are investors. Have you picked up any nuggets of wisdom or frameworks from them over the years?
Yeah. I mean, we've been really fortunate at Coda to have a very impressive, thoughtful, and available board, and just broader investor list. I think Reid and Mamoon are great. We've got a long slew of other folks too.
Yeah.
For each of them individually, my guess is if you followed them, on podcasts or in writings, the statement I'd probably make is that some of the obvious things are certainly true. Like with Mamoon, I think he's got a little bit of a reputation of being very numbers oriented and being able to spot winners. And I think that certainly comes across in working with him closely. The numbers don't lie. Mm-hmm. And with Reid, it was funny, especially when we were early on in Coda's journey, he would spend so much, like every time we'd come in for a board meeting and we'd go through a product review or whatnot, you could pretty much predict his suggestions. And I'd like to say we listened to him exceedingly closely and did a great job with him, but I feel like there was always a little bit more meat on the bone we could have gone. And it'd be around like people. It's like recognize the product experience is really about people. How are you thinking about people in your product as like a very first class thing? It's not just like the avatar bubble that shows up on a comment, but how is people like fundamentally going to be part of the product? Because I think he just really recognized and for a long time has had a perspective that at the end of the day, software is all human, or you need it to be human for it to be any good.
Yeah.
So anyhow, those are likely things that you'd get just by following them, on social or on podcasts or whatever they're in. I mean, interestingly, I'd say not just for the 2 of them, but for any of our board members, there's always this interesting relationship with investors, which is kind of like being with a coach, where it's like they're there for you, they're there for counsel, they're there to help you develop and like make connections and make the company or product succeed. But there's like an innate point of they never want to appear super impressed or like you don't really want to take away the drive from someone. So you don't want to say great job, but you want to say like good, but you could do better, And there's one story, I won't name the investor, but we were given a presentation this is like back in our pre-monetization days. So we're showing usage charts. Me and a data scientist are presenting for our board meeting. And we're showing this chart of a customer that has just exploded over the course of like 6 weeks. We're tracking this metric called usage days, which basically represents how many for any given user and doc, how much volume there is of usage across the account. So if like one user's got 10 docs, we count that as 10. If 10 users are all in one doc, that also counts as 10. Anyways, it's a good volume metric for us. And we're going through this one account that went from like 0 to, 5,000 over the course of 6 weeks. And one of our investors, who again is like, stoic and going to be complimentary, but always pushing, his statement was, well, that's not totally bad. And we were like, all right, that's about as good as we're going to get. Like we got to count that as a win. Perfect.
This is the least shitty suggestion I've seen today.
That's right. That's not horrible.
That's great. Matt, you mentioned that success is often attributed to luck rather than skill. How do you reconcile that with working hard and being smart?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. I think this is like a strong statement. And I think the thing I'm really pointing at is where good ideas come from. I'd actually say even like a podcast like this, people often overweight and listen to people that have been successful or are at successful companies, when in reality, if I were to go write an equation for success, it'd be like 1 part preparation and 1 part opportunity. And if you had to put weightings on those variables, it'd be like 0.2 on preparation and 0.8 on opportunity. So it's like mostly luck. So I think that there's lots of good ideas and good approaches that people don't hear about because whatever the initiative wasn't successful or didn't kind of make it out into daylight.
Yeah.
And you end up listening to folks who had a bunch of ideas and did things that didn't really matter because there was a great tailwind and they could have totally screwed something up, but the tailwind carried the whole company or carried the effort or whatever.
Timing as a tailwind is huge. I also think I don't even know if this math equation works anymore once I modify it here, but if you multiplied it also by just compound effort, and that's basically how many times you tried something until eventually something broke through or luck hit you in the face.
Totally. I mean, we ironically, all this comes back to first principles thinking. And I think my statement of you'd rather be lucky than good really comes back to what I look for in individuals is first principles thinking. It's not because a successful person did this, so I'm going to do it. It's like they really have dissected why they're going to do it. One of the prompts we give to new hires is you come into a new company that's in a growth phase, it's growing really well. And you think like, okay, they've got it figured out. Like, what am I as a new hire going to come in and do? And the advice we give them is to question everything. Like go in and ask a question of like every single thing. Why do you do maker billing? Why is it this price? Why? Just ask every question. The reason being, if there was a really good reason we did it, it gives us a chance to practice communicating, to practice like distilling the why in a short, succinct way so that everyone can learn it. We all kind of hear it again and nod our heads. And in the cases where we don't have a good reason, well, now it's like fair game to go think about it and go revisit it and go do something again with it. Maybe going back, there's another story I was just thinking about. Luck over skill and like where you learn things from. When I was back in high school, I played lacrosse and we had this head coach, this guy, Rich Martin. I grew up in the Illinois area, so it's not a particularly strong lacrosse hotbed, but he was kind of like the lacrosse godfather of Illinois lacrosse. And there was a big thread back then of should kids be solely focused on one sport or should they go do multiple sports? And he made the statement of you should go do multiple sports every time. Like don't do full time for one sport. And his rationale for it is that there's leadership lessons to being on teams that you're bad at. And in particular, the difference between being like the all-star, give me the ball with 1 minute left person and sitting on the bench for literally the whole season, you can learn a lot about leadership in both of those because you understand what it's like, you develop empathy. So kind of going back to luck versus skill, I think the reason why I make the luck statement a little bit is people don't look for lessons enough from people that weren't lucky. And you can learn a lot from people that tried really hard and failed rather than just the folks that kind of ended up on top who may or may not have had anything really important to do with it.
That's brilliant. Matt, I'm going to take you into what we call our long ass lightning round. So the first thing I ask everybody is you're a successful guy, but you got to give me one thing you've screwed up in your career.
I have we could do an hour on this. I think this could be its own thing. I mean, I could probably give you one. Maybe I think about a couple different categories. So maybe the simplest one, we were just talking about communication a moment ago. So maybe I'll start with communication. This must have been our Series B or Series C for Coda. We were out doing, a round with VCs, giving a pitch of product progress and usage progress or whatnot. And I remember going into one VC room and we went through our deck, product strategy, went through the usage metrics, and then we started to get questions around some of the metrics and some of the strategy. And one of the questions around metrics was an explanation for a very particular number. And I went into a very verbose explanation of the definition of the number and what it was. And it just clearly confused the whole room. Like everyone was not following. And I think the lesson there I'd give is if you have a choice between being comprehensive and accurate versus being concise / communicating well, you always pick the latter. Like if it's 20% comprehensive, but 100% comprehensible. You take 20% comprehensive and 100% comprehensible versus, being 100% comprehensive, but being like 20% clear. Like you never make that trade. It's always about clarity over comprehensiveness.
Oh yeah, I've done that. Just blinded people with my science, and they're like, "What are we talking about? ARR, net retention? Who is this guy?"
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I mean, you want to keep going on failures? I got other ones I could easily mention.
All right, give us one more. You're offering. You're being kind.
Yeah, let's see. What would I pick? I mean, I guess I'll pick a simple one, and maybe this kind of is encouragement for everyone to get into operator roles. Only because I think you really learn stuff by doing. And actually, early in my career, we haven't touched on this at all. Prior to Google, I bought a small business with one of my college roommates. It was a lofting manufacturer, so we build and install lofts for Michigan State, and Eastern Michigan. Had a 8,000 square foot warehouse, employed 40 guys with us. It was great. Full seasonal business, got to do it as a student. So I was 20 years old or 19 to 21 years old or something. What I was going to say was, as an operator, I learned so many very simple business decisions on that business. And the nice part was it was very low. There were no ramifications. Like it was not a big deal since it was like kind of in my own small bubble. It wasn't later in my career. The example I was going to give was, this is a simple one. We built lofts where you take wood, you put the bed above a desk in a dorm room. Kind of simple. It was a wonderful business and a wonderful product. We sold a single loft for $300. Our BOM on that was probably $120 with labor. So it's like a high margin, nice product. And we could install each like a loft in a room in probably 15 minutes. Like it wasn't a lot of effort, but then we started to add accessories. We added carpet, we added curtains around the loft, we added shelves, and those all took like 15 minutes to install. So it went from being like a 15-minute install job to an hour install job. And the margin on those things was also like 15%, but we'd sell a shelf for like $15. So we completely nuked like the logistics and operational efficiency of our business by adding all these accessories and not focusing on our core business, the thing we did well that produced money. And it was a total waste. We had a lot of opportunity that we left on the table. Anyways, tying this all the way back, boy, I can't stress enough of the benefit you get from being an operator. If you work with salespeople, try carrying a bag, try selling. And like now you'll have more empathy of like what makes it tick, what parts are broken, get into the details, that kind of thing.
Sometimes you just got to give the guy the ball and let him cook. That was amazing. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. That was awesome. What's one thing you wish you'd known earlier in your CFO career?
The short answer is probably, especially when I was younger, recognize how much time you really have. So I've got 3 kids now. I've been working for 20 plus years, and the vast majority of my days and weeks are completely committed, like minute by minute, hour by hour, with my team, with meetings, with customers, with my family. And I have to be like super deliberate about how I manage time and energy. I had to develop my own like system to go do it all. Back when you're younger and before you're kind of in these roles, you don't recognize that like you've got extra minutes all day, every day. And you can use that to progress whatever part of your goals, your life you want to, versus sitting on the couch and watching Netflix or watching, whatever. Like there's a lot that you can go do with that time that you won't have when you're older.
Yeah. I wish I could claw back those extra 90 hours of watching Breaking Bad on repeat. Maybe I don't, but
I don't know. Breaking Bad's great. What my trick is I staple that to some other activity.
Yeah. Like if you're on the treadmill or something.
Yeah. Exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
Can you walk me through your finance software stack? What tools does your team use to get the job done?
Maybe I'll broaden this a little bit to cover the full team. I mentioned it earlier. Obviously, we run a lot of things on Coda. Our monthly close, our board and investor communications, data rooms, all that stuff kind of goes through Coda, makes it nice and easy. Our finance stack itself, I think, is relatively vanilla in the sense we I think, like many small businesses, migrated from QuickBooks to NetSuite. Mm-hmm. Did that journey 2 years ago. Use Avalara for tax handling and billing through Stripe. I think we're one of the earlier customers of Pulley to do our cap table and equity management. We use Navan for business and travel. We use Benepass actually to do, I know one of the questions you had floated to me was around expensing. Benepass helps us kind of get around a lot of that stuff. And there's a pool that people get to use for whatever they want that works really well. What else? I think that's the major list.
That's a good one.
And then our data stack is relatively simple. Snowflake, Amplitude, Airflow, and then a long revolving door of BI tools. Partly with me being a very harsh critic of many of them.
I feel like you're the type of guy who builds his own data pipelines.
For certain. Although some of them it's like scary. Some of them I joke with the engineering manager that leads that team now of like, oh, if my name is on any of those PRs still, you need to the Git blame on that needs to be adjusted so that it's not me anymore.
Last one I got for you. What's the craziest thing you've ever had someone try to expense?
I mean, thankfully, I haven't had to do much of this at Coda. And I really tried to think long and hard about something that's meaningful or funny in this. This isn't an expensing story from Coda, and I wasn't actually in charge of finance when the story went down. But when I was at YouTube, we had a wonderful product leader that was beloved at the company, did really, really well. And I remember he got in hot water at some point because he finally got an EA to support him as he was like managing a big team now. And the EA came in, and it turned out he had 2.5 years of expense receipts he hadn't submitted, and that was not received lightly.
Goodness.
But yeah, the things you do for your A players.
Let that one slide.
Yeah, exactly.
Matt, this has been a blast for me. Thanks for being generous with your time. I know you got a lot going on, but this has been incredibly insightful.
Absolutely, this was fun.
Run the Numbers is a mostly LLC production. Yelling an intro by Fat Joe. Artwork by some AI thingamajig. Podcast and video editing is done by Cleancast at cleancast.io. Nothing said on this podcast is intended to be business or investment advice. It's the sole opinion of me, a guy who feeds his dog too much ice cream and has a history of net operating losses, LOL. If you like this podcast, please hit subscribe. It would mean a lot to me. And also check out mostlymetrics.com. That's my newsletter where I explore business models and financial metrics. Thanks for riding with me. Share this with your friends. Peace.